Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talks, a curatorial speaker series presented by Locus Projects and Alight Arts. My name is Lori Mertes, and I'm Executive Director at Locus Projects. My colleagues at Alight Arts and my team at Locus Projects are very excited to be joining you from our respective homes in Miami tonight for Talks with Kerry Brougher. Kerry's joining us from his home in Maryland. And if you're joining us on the chat, why don't you give us a shout out and let us know where in the world you're joining us from. And also, please use the chat to post your questions for Kerry for the Q&A after the talk. After my brief introduction, I'll turn the program over to Kerry, and then after his talk, Dennis Shull, President and CEO of Alight Arts, will join us to kick off the Q&A. First, a little background on Kerry. Kerry Brougher is Curator Emeritus at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and the founding director of the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles, where, from 2014 to 2019, he oversaw the building of a new Renzo piano-designed Academy Museum, which is planned to open later this year. For nearly 14 years, Kerry was the chief curator, deputy director, as well as interim director of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. He was also the director of Modern Art Oxford in England and curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles during its inception and formative years. Along with major retrospectives of artists such as Jeff Wall, Ed Ruscha, Hiroshi Sugimoto, Gustav Metzger, and Yves Klein, Kerry is known for numerous thematic exhibitions, many of which focus on the moving image. These include Hall of Mirrors, Art and Film since 1945, Notorious, Alfred Hitchcock and Contemporary Art, Visual Music, an exploration of synesthesia in art and music, The Cinema Effect, and Damage Control, Art and Destruction since 1950. Kerry also organized Song, artist Doug Aitken's monumental 360-degree moving image projection wrapping the entire facade of the Hirshhorn on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. His exhibitions and books have won numerous awards, including 2 first-place prizes from the International Art Critics Association. Kerry, I have an admitted long-time crush on your curatorial work, and I really can't wait to hear you take us through on a journey through the trajectory of your curatorial career, to hear about your influences and inspirations. And if you're ready, Kerry, I'm going to turn the program over to you. Thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Lori. Thanks so much. I appreciate that introduction. And I just want to thank Alight Arts and Locus Projects for asking me to do this. We were originally going to do it down in Miami, but as things turned out, we're here live and online. And I want to thank the rest of the crew too, by the way. There's a lot of people behind the scenes doing all these tech projects. So, thanks so much to Andrew Bird, who is working it back there, and Esther Park, and thanks to Deborah and Dennis Shull, too, for making this happen and for everything they do for artists. So thank you all. I'm going to go through quite a few images tonight. I tried not to call them slides there to date myself. But at the beginning, I'll probably go through a little slower to try to lay the groundwork in terms of who I am and where I come out of and the issues that I've had and where it's taken me on a kind of journey, curatorial journey. And then as we go on, I'll probably feed them a little bit faster until we get to the questions at the end. But so if we could pull up the first images, that would be terrific. Are they up, Andrew? Okay, great. Okay, what you're seeing here basically is a kind of summation of who I am and where I come from. On the one hand, I studied art history to begin with, and then sort of gravitated towards cinema. So on the one hand, you have a Roger van der Weyden from the Prado from the 1440s, a descent from the cross, one of my favorite paintings of all time. And on the other hand, you have my favorite feature film of all time, which is Jean Cocteau's La Belle et la Bête. And trying to reconcile the two sides I have with these two great loves, one of art history and the other of film history, has been the journey that I've been on for all of these years as both a curator and a director. It's the two poles. I've been schizophrenic my entire life trying to work this out. So it's both, I think, my weakness and my strength in terms of having two sides that I'm very interested in. This is UC Irvine, probably around, I don't know, 1966 or 67, a couple of years before I got there. And I grew up in Orange County. I like to say I grew up in a suburb of Disneyland, as it were. And when I went off to college, I went to study art history. And I felt that I was going to go to a university that was probably pretty conventional and relatively safe, and it would be, you know, easy and appealing in that sense. Little did I know, I was actually walking into a very progressive and extremely interesting environment at UC Irvine in 1970. People like Via Selmans, who you see in the upper right, were teaching there at the time, Tony DeLapp, Craig Kaufman, Bob Irwin, John Mason, Larry Bell, Alexis Smith. And then there were the students, such as Chris Burden. I used to hear about this, this grad student who was locking himself up in a locker somewhere and having himself shot in the arm over in Santa Ana at the time. So this was the milieu that I found myself in as an art history student. And from that point forward, my life was never going to be quite the same. They brought a lot of interesting people in to teach at Irvine. They didn't have a really large art history faculty at the time, so they were always bringing people through. And I was really fortunate to study under a man named Phil Leader. And Phil was one of the editors of Art Forum, one of the founding editors of Art Forum magazine. It originally had been in San Francisco. He, I believe, worked in Los Angeles at the time, then left the magazine. He had worked with John Copelands, who also had been at Irvine a few years before. And it was under Phil Leader that I really got my first taste of what I felt art history really was. I took a survey class from him that started in the Renaissance and lasted for 2 full academic years, and we just made it up to Goya. And one of the things that was really interesting about Phil Leader was that he didn't really focus on it as art. He focused on the artist and let you see what came out of the artist. So for him, the important thing was the artist rather really than the art. The starting point, anyway, was the artist. And he did these amazing articles for this magazine, Art Forum, which I started reading at the time and, of course, changed my life, such as How I Spent My Summer Vacation that you see on the right here, which has an image of Double Negative in it by Michael Heiser. Little did I know when I'd reached MoCA a few years later that we would actually acquire Double Negative for the collection when I was there. The other major influence at the time that really changed things around in my head was a book. And that book is called Expanded Cinema. I happen to have, and this actually is coincidence, I happen to have a copy of my copy of that book from 1970 when it first came out. This is the same copy. The spine is broken. It's all beaten up and it's held together by a rubber band now because I've used this book over and over. It's a book written by Gene Youngblood. And what it's about is about non-narrative film, non-narrative moving images, technology, opening up our minds and expanding our minds, a kind of transcendentalism, that is brought on by technology. And he spent a lot of time talking about these new filmmakers that I didn't really know at the time. Jordan Belson up in the Bay Area. He talked a lot about 2001: A Space Odyssey, which you see here, and how it was kind of one of the first non-narrative feature films, and how it was breaking new ground, that there were new possibilities. And the other thing that happened in about a year later, or so, a couple of years later, was that I took a trip to Paris. And the one image on the lower right-hand side that you're looking at is a polytope by Xenakis that I happened to wander into at the Baths of Cluny in the 5th arrondissement in Paris. And it was a amazing experience of sound, of light, of color. And I realized that what I had thought was art before could be expanded out into a much bigger field. I got a scholarship to go to Oberlin to get an MA in art history. And I still can't believe I did this even today, but I gave that scholarship up because I had become so interested in film that I thought I wanted to pursue that instead of going on with art history. I really couldn't stand the idea at the time, anyway, of writing one more paper about a Dutch artist, but I wanted instead to pursue these people that I had become very interested in. So I spent thousands of hours in Melnitz Hall that you see here, watching one feature after another and seeing these amazing, beautiful images, such as the one on the right from Shanghai Express by Joseph von Sternberg. And I saw a nitrate print. And if anyone has ever seen a nitrate print, you will never be the same afterwards, because the silvers that are in old nitrate prints are so beautiful. And you realize the incredible beautiful of this cinematography and of this director. But at the same time, I was sneaking over to the art library that was next door, and I was still reading Art Forum magazine. Now someone was writing for it named Annette Michelson, who became a kind of third influence on me. She wrote almost primarily about cinema, although not just about cinema, but she wrote about it as if it was a contemporary art form. Here's a copy of one of the issues that was devoted to Stan Brakhage and Sergei Eisenstein. And it became something I carried around with me all the time. And around this same moment, this magazine appeared called October, which Annette Michelson and Rosalind Krauss and Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe had founded. And I started reading that as well. The timing was perfect. You can see issue number 1 there. Noel Birch, a great film theoretician. Hollis Frampton, one of the greatest experimental filmmakers ever. Michel Foucault writing there. I mean, this was just amazing stuff. So I got into contemporary art, not through art history so much as through the cinema. I started watching the films of Stan Brakhage. I started watching Bruce Conner. I started watching the work of the Whitney brothers from California. And this was the material that actually led me to begin becoming more and more interested in contemporary art. And I was extremely fortunate that not too long after I graduated, the seeds were planted for a brand new museum in Los Angeles called the Museum of Contemporary Art. And they were just putting it together. And I was very lucky to get a position there. This is what was called at the time, the Temporary Contemporary. And I was there before this actually opened. So I was there right on the ground floor. You see an image of it being constructed up above. Frank Gehry was brought in to renovate it. And there's also an image there of a performance that happened before we actually opened called Available Light, which Julie Lazar, a really great curator who was there at the time, curated. Lucinda Childs did the choreography, and John Adams did the music. And this was really heady stuff. This was a heady period in which we just took anything on at the time because we didn't know any better. We just went for it. And it was an amazing period with Richard Kuschelk leading the museum, and with Julia Brown there at the time, Marcy Goodwin, lots of really great people that really brought me up to speed in terms of what contemporary art is. But I think probably the biggest influence on me at the time was a man named Pontus Hultén, who was the first director of MoCA. They had managed to bring him from the Pompidou, where he was the director of the Museum of Modern Art there, and he had been at the Moderna Museum before that. And he had done amazing shows, such as The Machine is Seen at the End of the Mechanical Age at the Museum of Modern Art, and these amazing series of shows that launched the Pompidou, such as Paris, Berlin, Paris, Moscow, and Paris, Paris. These shows really opened things up for me in terms of what I wanted to do later, because Pontus had a great interest, not just in painting and sculpture, but he also had an interest in bringing together other art forms into his exhibitions. Cinema was one of them, which he appreciated to a great degree, but also performance, dance, theater, design, all together in one exhibition. And so this freed my mind to thinking, well, a show didn't have to be just a paintings or sculpture, but it could be something beyond that that brought all the art forms together. He also really taught me to try to think like an artist and to be close to artists and to become friends with artists, because that's the way that you really start to think about how to put a show together, is if you start to think a little bit like an artist. I had the good fortune of being introduced to a couple people at the time through Julia Brown. One of them was Maria Nordman, who, by the way, in those early days of UC Irvine, the gallery was run first by John Copelands and then by a man named Hal Glicksman, who they did an amazing job with the gallery there. I remember wandering in one day and seeing this Maria Nordman exhibition, had no idea who she was at the time. And here I was now at MoCA, in the very early days of what was called the Temporary Contemporary. And right next door to the Temporary Contemporary, there was an empty warehouse space. And I started meeting with Maria in the mornings at Ray's Coffee Shop in Los Angeles. And we concocted this thing in which Maria would open the building up, flood the building, and the piece would simply be the water, the reflection, the light, and the sounds that came in throughout the day in the building. And this was art like I had never really experienced before, but I got it and I really loved it. And the second thing that I did was Julia had me work with Michael Asher, who was an amazing conceptual artist. And it's the very first piece really that happened inside of MoCA. And that was a transactional piece in which Michael Asher, I actually had to come up with a contract, and Michael Asher bought the lobby of the museum for a short period of time, so he would become a donor as well as the artist. So that's the Michael Asher lobby, and that's the very beginning of the Temporary Contemporary, now the Geffen Contemporary, as most of you know. And that's the piece. It's just that sign and a contract. And I just had to throw this in. A few months ago, they did an exhibition for the sign painter that I had worked with to paint that sign, Norm Leach, in Los Angeles. And so here it is, again, as an artifact, you know, some, 35 years, 40 years later. And I guess there's two artifacts there, the sign and me, looking into the case. They're pretty cool, though. I had the opportunity to work with Pontus and everyone else there to help put together the very first show, which was 8 major collectors from around the world to do an exhibition on the monuments of V. Totlien by Dan Flavin, which you can see at DIA now, but we did it back there in the early 80s. To work with Doug Wheeler to do amazing light and space work. And I also had the possibility of working on a couple things myself, pretty much alone. One of them was called Electronic Cafe, and it was done by Sherry Rabinowitz and Kit Galloway. And this was 1984, and this was cafes that were linked together by something similar to the internet at the time. And people could actually communicate from one cafe to the other cafe using computers. What an amazing idea, huh? And so it was kind of like a cyber cafe, and but it was so ahead of its time. And I got to do an exhibition on abstraction called The Image of Abstraction. So this was quite a fundamental period for me. The first two real major shows that I did there involved artists who I felt were sort of underrepresented at the time anyway. And that was a large pollen piece by Wolfgang Leib that was in one of the beautiful galleries at the new building that Arata Isozaki had built. And then a show of Hiroshi Sugimoto Seascapes. It was a small photography exhibition. It was, I believe, Sugimoto's first museum show ever. And he's mentioned that to me several times. So I had this desire, two desires there. One was to show artists who deserve to be seen and should be known better. And the second was to look towards abstraction in ways that weren't just in painting or sculpture. And so I think both of these kind of show that. But during this whole period, I was thinking about a larger exhibition. MoCA became known at the time for doing large thematic exhibitions which would explore a period of modern or contemporary art history and usually revisit it in new ways. And what I thought I could bring to that would be an exhibition about the ways that film and art had influenced one another and passed things back and forth. So I began to concoct in my mind this idea that cinema had kind of deconstructed itself in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, that feature film actually did this in the work of Orson Welles and the work of Billy Wilder, and that at the same time or shortly after that, artists started to deconstruct the cinema actually to make their work. And I started to think of this show as a kind of hall of mirrors and kept thinking of The Lady from Shanghai, Orson Welles' film, as this kind of reflection back and forth between the two disciplines. It's very hard to find images of Hall of Mirrors, art and film since 1945, but I found a couple. I'm sure MoCA has a lot in archives somewhere. But this was this was in the Temporary Contemporary. It's a very large space, and this is one corridor that was all devoted to Andy Warhol. The paintings on the walls, monitors that had the screen tests on them, and Empire in the background, which we would run the entire 8 hours every day. Even after the museum closed, we would finish it and then rewind it. We had a giant projector that could do that. It was actually shown in 16 millimeter. What was very interesting about this was that Warhol was making still what should have been moving, and of course making moving what actually should have been still. Hall of Mirrors was a quite large exhibition, about 30,000 square feet. And I'll just show you a couple things that were in it. But again, it took as its starting point things like Sunset Boulevard that you see in the upper left there, and Citizen Kane on the upper right, but also got into artists such as Ouija and their attempts to photograph inside of movie theaters without people seeing, using infrared light, and Cindy Sherman. And then in the middle, you see an homage to Jean Harlow by Bruce Conner. And then there was a desire in my part to not just make it about feature film and about artists' work, but to also make it about experimental filmmakers' work, which was art too. So we brought into it people like Tony Conrad and his work, The Flicker, which was just white or I should say clear and black frames, as was the work Arnulf Reiner by Peter Kubelka, and a screen that hung in the middle of the space called Two Sides to Every Story by Michael Snow. So it was also bringing experimental filmmakers into the brew. And here's one shot I found from this exhibition. The image in the lower left there is actually a very, very early Douglas Gordon piece. So we went all the way up to including Douglas Gordon, who was not known at all, particularly in Los Angeles at the time. And the backdrop is actually from Spellbound, the Alfred Hitchcock film, and was painted by Salvador Dali. And I just had to show this because one of the great moments of my life was having Billy Wilder come to the exhibition and being able to show him around. And I think he probably thought I was pretty crazy for doing the show, but it was such an honor to show him in particular around, since he was in a way the starting point for the exhibition. I moved on then. My last major show that I did at MoCA was a Jeff Wall retrospective, and I guess I did this for similar reasons, in the sense that I feel that Jeff's work is a little bit about the cinema and a little bit about photography and about theater as well, and of course about painting, all coming together in these light boxes and his other photographs. And I think that Jeff's concept that photography actually came out of cinematography, and that cinematography actually predates the birth of the cinema, was something that fascinated me greatly. I should just mention that we actually opened this exhibition at the Hirshhorn Museum and traveled it back, a place that I discovered at the time I could install really well in, and had a love for the Hirshhorn that came from this exhibition that would come back later. I then moved to Oxford, England, moved my whole family there, I should say, which was not an easy thing to do. But I became the director of what was called the Museum of Modern Art Oxford in those days. It's now called Modern Art Oxford. And when I got there, Chrissy Isles was the chief curator, and unfortunately she was just leaving. It would have been great to have worked with her for a longer period, but she had been trying to convince the board to do a show of Yoko Ono's work, and they weren't really having it at the time. They were too nervous. They weren't clear that she was really a great artist. And so when I came in, the first thing I did was put it on the schedule and had Chrissy do the show. And so it was a lovely exhibition. And I really think that Chrissy's show put Yoko back on the map in terms of being an artist, and not just, linked to the Beatles in some manner. My desire to bring artists to the forefront who I felt deserved greater recognition continued at the Museum of Modern Art, Oxford, with the work of Gustav Metzger. And Gustav is still, probably even to this day, not that well known, but he was a major performance artist at the time and conceptual artist. He did a series of events on the South Bank in the 1960s as protests against atomic warfare. These were acid paintings in which the painting would destroy itself as quickly as he could paint it with the acid. He would do historical photographs, only he'd bring them out into the room so that they became three-dimensional, they became part of the room. And he would do these things called liquid crystal paintings, which were basically projections that would heat up liquid crystal, and they would turn into almost psychedelic light shows at the time, kind of the material destroying itself, but creating something else. But I think we brought Gustav back, much as we did Yoko Ono there. And I co-curated this show with Astrid Boron, who was a terrific curator that I had there at the time. We did a lot of exhibitions at MoMA Oxford, but one that stands out for me is called Spellbound, or called Notorious, Notorious, Alfred Hitchcock and Contemporary Art. And this was an exhibition that explored the way that Alfred Hitchcock had influenced contemporary artists, people like John Baldessari, or Cindy Sherman, or Christian Marclay, and a whole number of people, Douglas Gordon. We wanted you, however, to bump into Hitchcock as you walked around the exhibition. So on the right there, you see film frames from a series of films that Matthias Müller and Christoph Girardet, two German experimental filmmakers and film installers, did for the show, which turned into an artwork itself and is played in a lot of places, including the Venice Film Festival since then. And it was a terrific piece. So here again, we brought film and art together. I should mention that I should mention that Notorious actually traveled around for about 3 years after we finished it, and it was traveling long after I left MoMA Oxford. Jim Dimitrian came over to England and we had dinner together, and he asked me if I wanted to become the chief curator at the Hirshhorn. And again, I was so lucky to be asked to do this, because the Hirshhorn had been a place I had always wanted to work ever since I had installed the Jeff Wall show there and explored their amazing collection and really amazing building. I have to say that the Gordon Bunshaft building, in my personal feeling, is that it's one of the great pieces of architecture for exhibitions and for collections. It's really a great museum. And I spent over 13 years there actually doing exhibitions, and I really loved every minute of it. However, Jim was not a big fan of photography or film, which were two things that I really liked a lot, even though I had done other things as well. There was a gap in the schedule. There was a series called Directions at the time, in which artists were given a project space to work in. And there was a gap, and he needed a direction show very quickly. An artist I had seen when I was living in England was this artist who wasn't well known at all at the time, named Tacita Dean. And so one of the first things I did at the Hirshhorn was to install 2 of her films as a directions exhibition. And what Jim said to me was, he said, no, he didn't really want to buy anything that you had to plug in, but that he would let me do exhibitions as long as they were temporary at the time, and we didn't buy them for the collection. He changed his mind on that later, but we had a lot of wonderful talks about that kind of thing. In fact, what happened then was there was another gap on the schedule when I came, and it was imperative that we got an exhibition lined up, a major one. And I had started to work with a friend of mine, Russell Ferguson, in Oxford on a show about street photography. And so we decided I talked to Jim into letting me bring it to the Hirshhorn. And so we did this show, which we were actually honestly quite worried about. We thought we were going to get nailed in the press by it, because we started the show with vintage real street photography, Robert Frank, Gary Winogrand, William Klein, Terrence Donovan, people like that. But as the show moved along, it started opening itself up to Thomas Strutt and to Beat Stroley and to Jeff Wall and to even Nikki Lee at the time. But to our surprise, it was very well received. And it's one of those shows in which I think we sort of broke with tradition. And the tradition of photography is actually a very strong one, but we took it to other areas. One of the things we did when we brought it from Oxford was we added on to it. And so here's a Beat Stroley video that is playing the street in New York. So it's also street photography, but it's also the moving image. Neil Ben-Ezra and I had been working together already on a retrospective of Ed Ruscha's work. So that actually was supposed to be in Oxford. We started talking, and it became a collaboration between the two institutions. So we did a retrospective, I think it was in about 2001, of Ed's work, which traveled down to Miami, by the way. We also brought shows in. One of the things I tried to do at the Hirshhorn as chief curator at the time, one of the things I tried to do was, instead of bringing so many shows in from elsewhere, we tried to do a lot of the shows ourselves, as you can see. One of the shows, however, I did bring from elsewhere was MoCA's Douglas Gordon retrospective, because I love the work so much. And I think this is the first time in the history of the Hirshhorn where an exhibition actually went all the way around the circle of the Hirshhorn, which is a quite big space, about 16,000 square feet. It was a wonderful exhibition, brilliantly installed by Douglas. But we also wanted to add to the show that came to us from the Hirshhorn, from Mocha to the Hirshhorn. And so we bought Play Dead, which is a really wonderful piece by Douglas Gordon, added it to the exhibition along with some other things. So this is something that I wanted to make a point about, and that is we used to buy things out of a lot of the shows or acquire them in one form or another, so that there was always something remaining from the exhibition in the collection after the show left. And often we try to include it in the show itself. We also started something during this show that became what is, I think, still going on at the Hirshhorn called After Hours, or it used to be called After Hours. And the first one was actually called 24-Hour Psycho, after Douglas Gordon's piece, and also 24-Hour Access, because we played it all night long, and we had about 6,000 people come to the museum to see the Douglas Gordon exhibition all night long. Now, one of the exhibitions that I did while I was at the Hirshhorn, and I did this with 3 other curators, all of whom were terrific. Judy Ziltzer, who was on my staff there, an amazing curator, particularly modern painting. And then also we combined forces finally with Mocha, where Ari Weisman and Jeremy Strick came on board and worked more on the contemporary parts of this exhibition called Visual Music. And for me, this is actually probably my favorite show that I've ever done. And the reason for that is it tries to chart out a new history of cinema, of painting, of abstract painting, from the beginnings to contemporary times. But it doesn't follow the normal course you'd follow with abstraction. You would normally start with, say, Malevich, and you would move eventually into the New York school, and then on to probably younger people still working in abstraction today. This exhibition instead started with the notion that abstraction had as much to do with music as it did with abstract painting, and that there was an attempt to emulate music in abstraction by Kandinsky and Kupka and others at the beginning of the 20th century. And we then continued that concept of synesthesia on through, and where that led wasn't the normal places. It led into the cinema. So we built theaters and showed film in this, and then it jumps not so much to the East Coast of the United States, but jumps to the West Coast of the United States, to Los Angeles and the Bay Area. The image on the left is actually the beginning of a film by Oscar Fischinger, and the one on the right is actually a psychedelic light show that we played in the exhibition. The exhibition covered things like color organs that had been pretty much forgotten, very beautiful work that you could actually play and images would actually appear. Very prescient, very much ahead of its time, very psychedelic in a way. And we did cover things, we tried to bring artists out who also hadn't received their due, people like Thomas Wilfred and his color organs, and a psychedelic light show artist who worked up to the Bay Area named Elias Romero, who probably still isn't that well known, but did absolutely gorgeous, beautiful work. These are just a few examples from a quite large exhibition. Or Oscar Fischinger's films, or on the West Coast of the United States, James Whitney, whose film Lapis has to be one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century, in my view, and his brother John Whitney, and then also John Whitney Jr., whose installations were amazing as well. And I think this is one of the first times in a museum in which films were actually played not off of a DVD or a laser disc, but we played them right off of a hard drive at the time. And I should thank a guy named Dan Summer, who came to the rescue with John Whitney Jr. to help us figure out how to do this in those days. And I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to come up with new technology in order to do this exhibition. We actually brought it right up to the present with work of Jennifer Steinkamp. And then on the right is a film by Jordan Belson, who I've mentioned before. He was still alive back then, and we commissioned a new work from him. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that I think commissioning new work for exhibitions is also something that I probably inherited from the early days at MoCA, when we were commissioning a lot of artists to do things, projects in those spaces. And this went in, of course, into the Hirshhorn collection. And so it was fabulous. So we worked with NASA on this, with Bert Ulrich, and also with the Center for Visual Music in LA. So it was quite a collaboration. And we also did a psychedelic light show with Joshua White, who had been one of the great psychedelic light show creators back in earlier times, along with people like groups like Single Wing, Turquoise Bird, and others. And we did another After Hours, which was a huge success. I found myself returning to a couple of the artists that I felt I had done small shows with at MoCA in the early days, but wanted to do much larger shows with. I had been very interested in the work of Hiroshi Sugimoto. And so we gave him a full-fledged retrospective at the Hirshhorn. We worked with the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, and my co-curator was David Elliott on this show. Of course, we did the movie theaters, which for me are essential, where Hiroshi keeps the shutter open for the entire duration of a film, and this light that's almost like a fictive light coming from another world illuminates the environment of the movie theater. And so you get this combination of fiction and reality together. An installation of the Buddhas that he had photographed, the Sea of Buddhas. Now, Hiroshi started to play around with the architecture of the Hirshhorn in new ways. For example, you can't really tell in the photo, but if you see that little break on the left-hand side, that's actually a mirror. And the mirror's there to hide a wall because we wanted it to run continuously. And he also took all the walls out of certain areas of the Hirshhorn and started to use the space probably much like Bunshaft had imagined it being used to begin with. So here's a whole series of seascapes. And by the way, this whole room of seascapes was acquired by the Hirshhorn through the generosity of Bitch Rails, and still extremely grateful that he bought that for the museum. Simultaneously with all these exhibitions, we were trying to build the collection of the Hirshhorn. And one of the big gaps in the Hirshhorn collection was actually, strangely enough, since the Hirshhorn opened in 1974, strangely a big gap was minimal, conceptual, and light and space art. So having known Count Giuseppe Panza di Buomo from my MoCA days, I went to him and asked if he still had things left from that period, and he did. So we actually worked with him and acquired from him 39 pieces that helped fill those gaps. Here you just see a handful, a Solowit wall drawing, a Hannah Darboven, Joseph Kossuth, and a Bob Irwin. But it went a long way to filling that major gap in the Hirshhorn collection. And also a Doug Wheeler came in at the same time. We also wanted to bring more women into the collection. Carolee Schneemann had been someone who had been in the Hall of Mirrors Art and Film exhibition I did at MoCA, and we were able to acquire her for the collection. We were also able to acquire another great woman artist, Yoko Ono, and this was partly the result of my wife, Nora Halpern. Must give her credit on this because she brought all of these wish trees into as part of street scenes into Washington, D.C., and one of them stuck. We got it as a gift from Yoko for the Hirshhorn. And we also were planning to do an Ai Weiwei retrospective, so we also bought an Ai Weiwei as just an example, a few examples of things we acquired for the collection. When I had gotten to the Hirshhorn early on, I noticed that we really didn't have Dan Flavin in the collection. So I suggested to Jim that Dimitrian that we get Dan Flavin, and Jim basically said, well, you know, you can't hang Dan Flavin on curved walls. And of course he was right about that. So eventually I found a barrier piece by Dan Flavin that didn't need to get hung on a curved wall. So we were able to acquire this piece, which I love a lot. And I'd like to run through an exhibition we did at the Hirshhorn and show you a few slides from it. The reason I want to do this is I want to give you a feel for how we designed this show. This is a show called The Cinema Effect, Illusion, Reality, and the Moving Image. And it was done in 2 parts. And Kelly Gordon, my film and video curator, and I worked on this part together called Dreams. And we actually decided we would install it like a dark ride from an amusement park. We wanted that feel to it as you moved through, that kind of dreamy, dark ride feel. So the first piece we put up was a work by Douglas Gordon in which you needed to pass through a red curtain, much like the red curtains that hide cinema screens. And on the other side of it was a projector that hit you directly in the face with the light, and you became the image on the screen. So you passed through the membrane, and then you ran into Andy Warhol's Sleep. There's John Giorno in Sleep, who we lost recently, unfortunately. And then there's a piece by Darren Ahmad, a projection of called Geisterbahn, which is actually moving through an old dark ride from early in the century. And then you come upon things such as Rodney Graham's Rheinmetall Victoria 8, which is a 35 millimeter film projection, not 16, but 35 millimeter of a typewriter, which snow is coming down on, a very dreamlike piece. And then they got a little darker, a little more nightmarish with the work of Saskia Wolbers and the work of Tony Ausler. Eventually, you came to an area of a work that we owned at the Hirshhorn with San Francisco Modern by Gary Hill that was appropriately enough titled Suspension of Disbelief. And then into a room of an Anthony McCall solid light piece, which is fog and light from a projector. And then, this is, I'm not giving it its full due, but one of the last things in the show that you saw was this piece by an artist named Kelly Richardson, in which meteors are falling to Earth. They don't seem to be harming Earth, but there's this feeling that something could happen. And so this whole kind of nightmarish process of moving through this sort of dark ride was the way we brought this show together and realized it. We also did exhibitions out of the collection that were thematic exhibitions, such as Fragments in Time and Space, which was the title to a Mark Tobey painting that we owned in the collection. There's an Ed Ruscha in the background. We had rooms devoted to Richard Long, Ian Hamilton Finley. We had a room devoted to I'm blanking on the name right now, but it will come to me in my notes here. So let's see. Well, I'll come back to that when I hit it here. Oh, yes, Wolfgang Tillmans. How could I forget? Wolfgang Tillmans, who we had acquired for the entire collection. We had acquired this whole room for the collection. And then I guess one of the other shows that I really enjoyed the most doing was the Yves Klein retrospective, which I did with Philippe Verne and The Walker. And when you came to the show, the thing that I said early on about artists actually feeding you the material for your show, we didn't do a didactic panel in this show. It was only the words of the artists. And we were using Klein's words to create the exhibition. It was called With the Void, Full Powers with the Void. So it was a show in which it was really about the artist Yves Klein. And so you ran into him in the first room in which he presented the void to you as a blank wall. We had his monochromes in which he was looking for a kind of sensibility through mere color and not form. And this, of course, led to the IKB monochromes, which were an incredible room that we actually created several rooms of the monochromes, blue being the color that he felt would open up and allow you to plunge into the void. And then, of course, the sponge reliefs and the anthropometry paintings. Levitation was the idea that these colors could actually make you levitate. He first saw the color blue when he thought of himself on a beach floating above in the sky and looking back down on the earth in the blue sky. So levitation was always a part of his work, as was the concept of destruction. So when you destroyed something with fire, you created a fire painting and images came out of it so that you would actually be able to create something from a destructive act. And this would come back in some later work I did. And I put Godzilla in here because he's a metaphor for the next show, which kind of comes right out of those fire paintings of Yves Klein. And that is a show called Damage Control, Art and Destruction since 1950, which I worked on with Russell Ferguson. This was a show that we took a look at sort of destruction as a metaphor, destruction as catharsis, destruction as an act of creativity in modern and contemporary art. And the first room, you had a large wall of slow motion studies of atomic bomb explosions by Harold Edgerton. And the night before the exhibition opened, we had Rafael Ortiz, this great performance artist, destroy one of his pianos in one of his famous performances. And then we brought it into the first gallery and installed it there. We also included in the exhibition work by Jean Tinguely. This was actually a work that he did with David Brinkley in the early 1960s on television on CBS. A cut piece by Yoko Ono. We had work by Steve McQueen. This, of course, based upon a work by Buster Keaton from the 1920s in which the house falls on you, but it brings on different meaning when Steve McQueen's actually doing it. And work, of course, by Pipilotti Rist. This also coming out of cinema in a way because she's sort of mimicking the idea of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz as she smashes car windows. And then in the last gallery, as an example, Marisha Cantor and a flag which is dematerializing as it blows in the wind, and a wonderful work that I won't read the whole thing by Chris Wool, but it's about an audience standing up and realizing their coats and their home is now gone. And I just wanted to point out that I think it's extremely important that curators do publications with all of their exhibitions as much as possible anyway. And I want to thank Deborah Horowitz, who worked on a lot of these with me and who actually also helped me while I was interim director of the Hirshhorn a couple of times, almost like a deputy director at the time. But publications are very important, and I think writing essays are extremely important. So this is a series of some of the publications that I've done over the years. I wanted to show you how we began using the spaces at the Hirshhorn. You saw the Hiroshi Sugimoto seascapes. Here we brought in the shadow paintings of Andy Warhol and took out all of the walls. And here is an Ai Weiwei retrospective that I mentioned a little while ago, but just an example of a use of space, how you could move from the outer ring of the Hirshhorn to the inner ring of the Hirshhorn, the ambulatory, and actually make use of several different kinds of spaces. The Hirshhorn itself is, if nothing else, it's the largest screen in the world. And this wasn't lost on Doug Aitken when he came to visit the museum, and he wanted to do a film projection onto the Hirshhorn. And so that's exactly what we did. And as Laurie mentioned at the beginning, he did a piece called Song 1, which was really the song I Only Have Eyes for You, repeated over and over again with different imagery, a little bit like a music video, but not quite. But it was projected 360 degrees around on the Hirshhorn, and it really brought the whole place to life. The museum itself, the building, kind of disappeared, became transparent, became kind of like liquid architecture. And so a different kind of feeling. The building disappeared, and instead cinema was in its place. A moving image was in its place. Hundreds of people came every night to take a look at Song 1, and it was very gratifying because if any of you have been on the National Mall at night, you know everyone disappears pretty much from there. So to be able to bring all those people there at night was really a nice thing. Very, very happy with the way this project turned out. We were very fortunate. It was springtime, and it was an early spring and very warm out as well. It took 11 projectors, projection mapped, of course, to the curvature of the Hirshhorn to make this a reality. Not an easy thing to do, but a very rewarding project. And it led me to start thinking about cities in different ways. The cities really are places that no longer are filled with concrete and steel, but are filled with a kind of ephemeral liquid architecture, moving images, that things change in cities. I was just in Shanghai a few months ago, and I took this image, and it should be a video to show you how everything is changing in the image, and and then you get consortiums of artists such as Team Lab, who are now working with projection mapping, and who I wanted to bring out to California to actually be one of the first projects at the new Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, which we'll turn our attention to as the last thing here. The Academy had wanted to build a film museum since about 1929, the year they started. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks actually said back then that they needed a library, which they did do pretty quickly, but they also needed to start thinking about a film museum. Jump ahead to the image on the right, which is 1956, in which they're announcing that the film museum is finally going to become a reality. That's 1956. Finally, about 6 or 7 years ago, they really did get their act together, and they acquired this building from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, called the May Company Building. It's really a landmark in Los Angeles. It has this gold cylinder, and that became the building that was going to be renovated into this new Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, which they called me about and asked if I'd like to come out and be the director. I had always wanted to start a film museum in Los Angeles. And one of the great pulls for me to do this was that Renzo Piano was going to actually not only renovate that building, but do a large spherical attachment to it for a new movie theater. So here we are talking in New York City, actually, about the project with Whoopi Goldberg. The project has pretty much come to fruition now, in the sense that the building is pretty much done. We renovated that entire May Company building, returned it to its original form, and renovated that cylinder on the front, which was a huge process. 300,000 tiles, I believe, were put back onto that structure. And this is a rendering of what, from the side, it was going to look like, with the May Company building on the right-hand side, which would house the museum, and then it would be linked with these glass bridges to this new structure, this spherical structure, which would be the new 1,000-seat theater. And this is how it finally came out, which is almost exactly like we were imagining it. And so that's a picture of how it looks right now. Not much left to do on it, just a little bit more of the landscaping, and then to do some things inside. But you can see that this is two buildings, one very industrial, connected to an streamlined, modern building, and the two work, I think, beautifully together. The sphere itself actually is raised off the ground by two footings, and floats, and there's a feeling of a kind of magical feeling about it. The image on the left is a Zeppelin, which is parked on almost the exact site where this Academy Museum of Motion Pictures is now. And it was an inspiration, I think, to Renzo, that a museum of motion pictures, a theater, could actually be a transportation machine. You could get in it, you could sit down, you could take off, and you could go elsewhere, to other places and other times, to the past and into the future. On top of that sphere is a deck, And that terrace looks out over Hollywood and the Hollywood sign. And here you see it as it is now almost finished out in California. This is about 3 or 4 months old now, so it is finished at this point. And actually, you see Park La Brea out there where I used to live. And this looks out over Los Angeles, and you have the feeling that you're flying when you're on top of this. This is a cutaway of the museum itself. Renzo and I worked together. We changed quite a bit in the building when I got there. We made the gallery spaces more flexible. We gave it more gallery space. We made room for a gallery right in the lobby area. There were 2 small little theaters in the gallery space, which we combined together to make a larger theater downstairs so we could run it at night when the exhibitions weren't on. And we did other project spaces for the building. The 1,000-seat theater inside that sphere, this is a rendering of what it was to look like when it's a little bit dark. And this is how it has come out now today, very close to the original way that we were looking at it and that Renzo's concept was for it. This is the smaller theater that we put downstairs. I might add that both of these theaters are equipped with not only the latest digital projection and sound, Dolby, but they're also equipped with 35 millimeter and 70 millimeter, which is being torn out of almost every theater in the world right now. And in fact, if a museum can do anything for cinema right now, the one thing that it actually has to do is to be able to present the films the way I saw them in Melnitz Hall very early on in my career. And so not only can we show them in 35, 70 millimeter there at the Academy Museum, but in the larger theater, we can also show nitrate prints. So this was, I think, extremely important for a movie museum. And this is that theater under construction. The building itself is full of transparency. It's full of light and shadow. It's full of moving escalators and moving people. It's very cinematic in that sense. It's not a cinema of darkness, but it's a cinema of light and darkness. And I think, therefore, is cinematic itself. And there's a lot of spaces that can be utilized that aren't just in the gallery spaces. One of the items we brought into the collection was Bruce, the shark from Jaws, which would be, we think anyway, I don't know what they'll do out there now, but we hope to hang right in the escalator lobby. While I was there, we worked on concepts for the first exhibitions, which will happen, I think, at the end of this coming year. One is Hayao Miyazaki retrospective, one of the greatest animators of all time. And the other is called Regeneration, which is a show that will trace Black cinema from 1900 to 1970, before Blaxploitation, and actually won the Sotheby's Prize already for most innovative exhibition. We also acquired a lot for the collection. They didn't have a lot in 3-dimensional work there, although they had a great library with 2-dimensional work, but we started acquiring 3-dimensional things like models. This is the only extant model from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which we were able to get our hands on. And one of the last things I acquired before I left, but I worked on this for 4 years with my staff, was the original cape that Bela Lugosi wore in the 1931 Dracula, which was a donation or partial donation from Bela Lugosi Jr. Since the museum wasn't open yet, we also wanted to do a series of events. Here's 2 of them. One of them was about film's future with Tacita Dean and the director, Christopher Nolan, in which we talked about, and actually one of the executives from Kodak, because what it was about was trying to save the material of film itself, so that film could be shot digitally, but that we wanted to retain the idea of film being able to be shot on 35 millimeter film or 70 millimeter film and not just go digital. The other was a talk I did with Guillermo del Toro, who's a wonderful director and a wonderful individual. The exhibitions themselves, I hope, will mimic the idea of transparency and reflection that the building has, the use of mirrors, the use of glass, the use of transparency, the use of multiple screens like contemporary artists, the use of screens that perhaps you can see through, and the use of our objects with montages surrounding them. There's a great designer working on this project, so I'm sure it's going to come out very well, a guy named Kulapat Yantrasast, who's a friend of mine, and I think will do a really good job with it. We also, with costumes, we didn't want it to be just a costume case. We wanted it to be a case that had images that were moving in it and that could be actually projected on, so you'd see the studies for the costumes as so you could understand the work that went behind the creation of these things. And again, it was the idea of bringing reality, and much like the cinema effect, the idea of bringing reality, reflecting in fiction, and fiction into reality together for the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. My daughter took this photo just about the time we left Los Angeles. And it's a beautiful photo of the actual sphere. And then I got back here to Washington, D.C. And I had dinner with Russell Ferguson, who happened to be here. The second night I was here, and on my way to dinner, I snapped this photo of the Washington Monument, and it was covered in fog and mist. And there was something about it that seemed to spell what was in the works for all of us coming in the future with the coronavirus and the art world going to have to do things in different ways and to look at the future in different ways. So I think there's another chapter to come, but it's going to be very different. So thanks very much. And I think, I hope we have time for questions, and I'd like to bring in Dennis Shull.
Hi, everybody. Andrew, can you confirm that people can hear me? Kerry, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Wow. That's a real career, dude. That's a lot of amazing artists, a lot of amazing curators, a lot of amazing places. So I know everybody is super appreciative for you being willing to both do this conversation with us and do it under these exigent circumstances that we're all operating under. Really, really an amazing. I learned a lot about your career tonight, and I thought I knew a lot. So
thanks. And that's not all of it, but I'm getting older. There's a lot of it now.
So let me ask you a couple of questions that I've been thinking about as you went through this. You talked about Doug Aitken and that amazing piece. You talked about doing a show with Jeff Wall. And I get what you're thinking about when you think about your love of cinema and your scholarship of cinema. And I'm wondering, are there other artists that you wound up choosing to work with that are not as obvious as those guys based on your love of cinema, like Wolfgang Leib, Yves Klein? I mean, I think of those artists and you don't naturally think of cinema that way. Are there other artists that you've worked with that you found a thread from cinema to them that might not be obvious for the rest of us?
Yes. Well, let's take Ed Ruscha as one example. That's a painting show, right? More or less, painting and prints. And Ed has made a couple films, but he has, those were back in the 70s. So he's not really a filmmaker. And yet his work has an awful lot to do with cinema. And, it has to do with LA. It has to do with the culture there, but it also has to do with the movie studios. It has to do with seeing the Hollywood sign, the front of it, and seeing the Hollywood sign and the back of it going backwards, and which is saying something about, I think, the movie business and about cinema. His way of shooting every building on the Sunset Strip is also very cinematic. It's one frame after another frame. It's very much, like My Bridge or Marais. And so I think, Ruscha would be an example of this. John Baldessari is another example who I've worked with. And, his work had a lot to do with cinema, with stills. He didn't like to know, by the way, what film they were from, because that seemed to close it down for him. But he would use film stills all the time in his work, and it generated a kind of, I think the word cinematic is probably overused, and it probably means something more spectacular, but it also means something that seems embedded within the movies, and embedded within our psyche, because the movies have been around for 120 years now. And so I think, he certainly has made a great use of cinema while not being a filmmaker per se.
So, I've been an art collector for over 40 years, and people always ask me about my relationship with artists. And I really have a one-line answer, which is I collect art, not artists. But it was very interesting to hear you when you were talking about Pontius saying, or Demetrian saying, think like an artist, be close to artists. Is it really important as a curator in your career? Has it been important to be close to artists, or is it important to be close to the art itself?
Well, in my case, it's been a little of both. I don't mean to dodge the question, but it's been a bit of both. This is probably too mundane to point out, but it's funny, Gombrich, the great art historian, I think he points out in his story of art book, I think the first thing he says in the book is, there really is no art, there are only artists. And I sort of think I know what he means. In the sense that, there are these pieces that come out of artists, but the only reason they're there are because of the artists and the way they think. And I think it's the artists themselves that actually, change the world for us, react to the world and change it. What's very interesting about art, one of the things that I've always thought is, I worked for Julia Brown as assistant curator on a Alan Ruppersberg retrospective. And I remember Alan saying to me, it only takes just a little change, a little bend to make something that comes out of the world into a work of art. And I think that's true. You just slightly change it. The ultimate idea is, of course, Duchamp, I suppose, but it's that way with other things. With Baldessari, just taking a film still and putting a dot over it. It doesn't take a lot to make a big statement, but those statements come out of the thinking of the artist.
Sure. I'm wondering, I got to know you, I think, probably best and first when you were at MoMA Oxford. And I'm wondering, did you have to adapt your curatorial decision-making for that audience over there? Did you have to do things differently? You did a show of an artist that I was always very close with, and the first artist I collected in depth, Anna Gaskell. And
yes.
You did a lot. You did a lot of other things over there, but I'm wondering if you had to change your approach because of being in the UK versus here.
I think there's two levels to that. The approach was a little bit different. First of all, there were different artists who had been established compared to the States. I think it probably would have been even harder to do a Gustav Metzger exhibition at that time anyway, here in the States, than over there. Even over there, of course, it was considered a kind of radical thing to do. Why are you bringing him back? Who was this guy again? But he was had lived in England for so long. He was British, so it was possible to do that. Same with Yoko Ono, I think. So one had to think about that. One also had to think about money a lot over there, because it was extremely difficult to raise money in England, and it's very different than the tax write-offs here in the States. Then there was another level on that, which was Oxford. And, the Museum of Modern Art Oxford isn't connected to the university. I mean, we have informal connections to the university. And there were some great people at the university, like Martin Kemp, the great Leonardo da Vinci scholar who loved contemporary art, by the way. So we had our friends, but Oxford wasn't a place that you would normally think of to go for contemporary art. Yet over the years, one of the first directors there was Nick Sirota. and another one was David Elliott, who later I worked with. And so it was quite a cast of characters that had brought modern and contemporary art right into Oxford. But in some ways, it was almost a radical aspiration to bring it into Oxford. So that was a very different situation, even from, certainly from MoCA and to some degree from Hirshhorn.
Sure. When I saw the Douglas Gordon work, I was reminded of a conversation I had with Douglas many, many years ago. We were friends, and he announced he was going to Gagosian to change galleries to go to Gagosian. And when I saw that still you put up, I remember saying to Douglas, why would you go to Gagosian? You're never going to matter there. You know, you're never going to sell enough art there. I mean, you're just not going to be super relevant there. And he looked at me and he said in that great Glaswegian accent, he said, Dennis, he says, who the hell else is going to let me bring an elephant into the gallery?
And he did.
I had no rebuttal to that between you and me. So I had no rebuttal.
And I think there was a lot of things that the Gagosian Gallery could do for him in terms of rights issues for some of those works as well. Yeah,
he was always dancing on a tightrope with many of those. One of our viewers, a really wonderful working artist, Odalis, asked, do you ever collaborate with musicologists or in-house architects to either propose show or to structure how you stage them?
Yes. The Hall of Mirrors, the art and film exhibition, we actually worked with architects to do the design for that show, named Craig Hodgetts and Ming Fung. Hodgetts and Fung, and they were terrific. They were wonderful people. We actually sort of built a giant camera in the middle of the show, and it was almost like you were pulling cinema inside out. You were almost like on the inside of a camera instead of the outside of a camera. So that was a lot of fun. I had the good fortune to work on the inaugural show for the opening of the Temporary Contemporary, now the Geffen Contemporary. And I also got to work on the exhibition that opened the Arata Isozaki building on Bunker Hill for MoCA, in which we did a show that was in both buildings then. So we used Frank Gehry to design the show. It's called Individuals, the exhibition, in the Temporary Contemporary, and we used Arata Isozaki to design the show over at the new building in Bunker Hill to open it up. It was one show that was linked together. I actually thought they should have swapped the architects and made them work in one another's buildings, but it got more conventional than that. But it was a very interesting experience, by the way, because I kind of met with both of them, and the experience was very different. Arata Isozaki came over, and I showed him the works that we wanted to show in the Bunker Hill building. And I remember sitting with him, and he rolled out a piece of paper and he drew like 2 or 3 lines on it and said, okay, that's your exhibition. Those are your walls. It was done. It was over. And I think he went back, he made one little adjustment for, to have a header above one thing.
Yeah.
And then Frank Gehry was a whole different process. It was a process where I show him the work and he would play with it and change it and push it. And it was a lot harder work in that building too, like Richard Serra. So it was tougher, but it was a very different experience.
We've got about 6 or 7 more minutes. I want to try to rock through some of these questions. Angie asked, are there specific examples of international cinema that you think have impacted the time-based art that we're looking at over the last period of time? I was wonderful to see the Steve McQueen piece, which I think is a super important work in time-based art. But are there examples of international cinema that you think artists are looking at and really drawing from?
It's interesting. Yes, there are. I mean, I think often, not always, but it is international cinema that they look at. Korean cinema right now is amazing, as you probably know, Dennis. Mickey Lee, I brought onto the board out in Los Angeles, and she was the producer of Parasite. And I don't think you could get a film that probably influenced so many people as Parasite. I mean, architecturally as well. And, there's just been a whole host of international cinema that I think has influenced artists. even today, I think the French New Wave, Godard, Truffaut, Agnes Varda, have been extraordinarily influential on artists of the past and artists even today. And so I do think, Antonioni is another one I think that has been extraordinarily influential. But then there's another group of artists, I hesitate mentioning this because I didn't really talk to him that much about it, but I remember having a conversation with Chris Williams, for example, about film. And he loves to go to action movies and movies that have lots of explosions in them for the sheer excitement and the visual spectacle of the whole thing. So, influences come from all places, I guess.
One of the things that I've always appreciated greatly, and I've seen it used to very good effect lately, and I wonder, seeing this, the Sugimoto photo in the Hirshhorn, is that curve. I mean, what Mark Bradford did with it was extraordinary. It was literally the most beautiful show I'd seen in a few years. Did you find that curve both daunting and inspiring? I mean, the Sugimoto one is a great example.
Yeah, when I heard that when I was still at MoCA and had done Jeff Wall, and I heard that we were going to have to swap, places for the shows, and it was actually going to have to open at the Hirshhorn. And I'd been to the Hirshhorn, and I went, oh my God, there's curved walls there with these big light boxes. This isn't going to be
just one.
Yeah, and so I went there and installed. And, a great crew there installing, and we got it like we liked it. And then I went back and I installed it at MoCA in the Iradi Isesaki building. And I liked it better at the Hirshhorn. And I think it was because the curve, it's a gentle curve. And if you install correctly on it, it's almost like CinemaScope. It's like Cinerama, and your eye is led around and from side to side instead of looking through a wall at the end into another room where something's hanging way on another wall. You're not drawn so much that way. You're drawn by the curve itself. So it has a kind of cinematic quality to it. So that worked for me really well. And also, the Hirshhorn is laid out as a circle with a hole in the middle. So you start on one side and you have to follow one line around. So that worked as a narrative for me. You couldn't choose to go into that room on the right or that room on the left or the room behind you or the room before you. You had to just follow the circle, the curve around. So you always knew what people were going to see, one thing after another. So you had to be very aware of that, but it was a lot of fun because you'd say, okay, now they're going to see this, and they'll see this they'll just come around and see it in the distance and it'll pull them. And you knew exactly what they were going to see next. So, and then it was always a surprise when you came out of the show because you didn't realize you'd gone all the way around.
Exactly. So
I loved installing at the Hirshhorn. The only time the Hirshhorn could be a little bit of a problem is if you had a show like Anselm Kiefer, which were giant paintings. I mean, really big paintings. And then what happens is that the painting starts to hang so far out from the curve that you start to get a shadow underneath of it, which adds an element to it that doesn't always look good. And you get these kind of faceted looks to it. But that didn't happen very often. It also works really well for sculpture.
I've got a question here from my friend George, who asks specifically, are you seeing work in virtual and augmented reality that goes beyond technical wizardry and mystification? And I agree with that question. I think that artists sometimes, when they become early adopters, they spend a lot of time learning how to use the technology, but not executing the technology in service of message or story.
Yeah. The technology thing's funny. Dennis, I'll admit something to you. When I did Hall of Mirrors in 1996, I actually thought we were at the peak of the use of the moving image at that time. It was probably going to go downhill afterwards.
Nice try.
I was totally wrong, completely. It was just the opposite. It went up and up and up, and the use of the moving image just got, better and better. And I have to say that, yes, I think that's absolutely true. When artists start to use a technology, sometimes the technology is in the foreground and the content is somehow in the background, and it doesn't always work. As they get more comfortable with it, it starts to reverse itself. And then I think you start to get works that the technology is secondary to the actual piece itself, and the technology is only a tool to get to where they want to get to. But it's absolutely true that when, I think this is maybe why people haven't gone back so much to visiting early internet art yet. I mean, there's this whole period where there was a lot of stuff done on the internet, some of it pretty good, a lot of it, just kind of internet looking. And I was talking to Randall Packer recently about why haven't people gone back to look at this? It kind of died out. It was like there around the year 2000, 2004, and now it's kind of disappeared. And it's still being made, but people don't seem to be quite as interested in it. The moving image, on the other hand, it just keeps getting used more and more. And now there's a real blur happening, I think, between feature motion picture and what we would have considered an artwork in the old days.
So to wrap it up, the final question, which I received from no fewer than 3 or 4 people, is what artists are you looking at now? Who do you have a burning desire to work with? And I'd like you to answer giving me somebody with a little more mid-career to later career, and also a couple total newbies.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a tough question right now, because I'm looking at, at so many people. I finally have the time after 5.5 years out in Los Angeles to start looking at art again. So, I can tell you the show that I wanted to do at the Hirshhorn before I left. That was my next show. Probably wouldn't be a surprise to you at all. And it's, a show that I've still talked to her about off and on over the years, but and we want to do it, but we just haven't gotten around to it. Is a full retrospective of Tacitidine, and that's the show I actually probably want to do the most right now. But when I mentioned that I was interested in cities and what was happening with the city, I've become more and more fascinated with the idea that art doesn't always have to be in a gallery space, and that it can be outdoors, and that it can be projected and mapped in different ways onto different things. And, the question from the one gentleman about, say, projection mapping, there's a lot of that going on that isn't so interesting right now. Some of it is, and I think it's going to get better and better. And I'm starting to wonder whether art, and this may come around to what we're talking about with the coronavirus now and what museums are going to be in the future, that bigger spaces, wider spaces, and both the inside and the outside of the museum, or not even the museum, but the city itself, will become one of the ways to experience art in the future. So I'm thinking about some projects along those lines that I hope maybe to realize at some point.
Awesome. So thanks so much, man. This is really a great night for us. This melding of cinema and art is something that so many of us embrace and love deeply. And I want to thank our audience tonight. Huge audience for us. Really appreciate it. Tonight is our last talks of the season, but we will be back in the fall in September, October, and November with some friends of Kerry's, including Dan Cameron, Aaron Cristobal, and Nicholas Baum, who is the head of the Public Art Fund in New York City. And if you missed any of our past talks, including this one, it'll be up soon online at Talks Miami, hashtag talks.miami, talks.miami. Want to thank our sponsor, Cultured Magazine. Want to thank my brothers and sisters at Locust Project. Alight Arts is working really hard, as Locust is. We both announced programs to help artists locally. We're both out there trying to make this easier for folks. I know it's a tough time for working artists, but both of our organizations are doing everything we can to make sure that people make it through this. So I want to thank everybody. I want to also thank Denise and Andrew for the tech tonight. It was flawless. And that Alight team, Esther Park, everybody. So thanks very much. Thank you, Kerry.
Thanks. I look forward to coming down to Miami and visiting with the artists.
Kerry's coming down to do studio visits, everybody. We're not giving up on that.
The artists are the important thing.
That's right. When we're all holding hands again, he'll be here. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.